All right. Welcome, folks. So this is going to, I think, be a relatively short talk. And the intention of this talk was to orient new folks who are here. Welcome, everybody. And also, I feel that some of the feedback I've been getting is like code organization is something that isn't being focused on as much in this space. So I just wanted to start off this week by like having that as a focus for everybody, so everybody can sort of help each other and like get on the same page on what it's like to structure your code in a way that is easy to maintain and to develop, and it's intuitive when you want to find something. So has everyone seen the contact snapshot project? I guess new folks haven't. So most of the projects that we have in this phase are based off of this scaffolded project called Contact Snapshot. And this project just contains like, it's on GitHub. Contacts. Great, GitHub. Okay.
Refresh, it'll probably go through. Or it has been on.
Hey, I have the code here, so I can show you. So it's basically, I can show you. It's basically a project which has a database, which has like a contacts table, and then we have. Is the size okay over there? Do you want me to increase it?
Yeah, a little bit bigger. Yeah.
And then there's like corresponding files which are used to manage this table in the database. So we have a routes file for the contacts. We have a views folder which shows like the different pages that exist on the app. So this isn't a very like superly well organized, because I think like the views folder is just like a bunch of flat files. It would be better if you have more context around what kind of files are these things associated to. So we can talk about that in a bit. So what I wanted to get out of this talk is everyone should have a clear understanding of if I'm working on a specific piece of code, I would know exactly where to put this, which file should this piece of code live in. That's the intention of this talk. Okay, so let's say we have a specs, right? So let's say we have to create a function that shows the most popular contacts. Can you make the font a little bit? There we go. So create a function that shows the most popular contacts, right? So if you look at this spec, you would probably divide this up into like smaller specs, right? So there's one piece which is like, I want to like create a database function, right? So create a database query which fetches popular contacts from the database. And then there's like create a route on the API which exposes basically get it out on the API for this functionality. And then there's create a view file for this page. Right, so kind of like 3 subtasks, given that this spec that I have. So if you individually want to tackle each of these things, you kind of have to start thinking about where would I place this, right? So if you go back to the structure of our code, we have, so usually the way I would like to organize my code is I put all of my code inside the source directory. So the project has a source directory and a test directory. So it's very obvious as to like, there's a difference. Like all of my source code, which is related to my app itself, lives inside the source directory, and all of the test code lives in the test directory. And then there's a public folder which contains like, if you're using Webpack or like some other tool which kind of generates like a JavaScript bundle for us, that would live inside of the public folder. And then we have a README and a package.json. So inside the source folder, in most web apps, we have this idea of a model view controller, which is like the design pattern we use, which basically states that you're dividing your code up into like 3 separate, I would say, parts, for lack of a better word. And the model portion contains like how you interact with your data. And your data could live in a database, it could live in a file, it could live in some other project, like some other place, some other server, so you're interacting it using HTTP. But it's just basically some sort of a abstraction, and to say all of my data comes from this model, Right? Similarly, the controller is kind of the analogy is the routes, right? Like all my routes are going to be the place which orchestrates fetching of the data and then sending the data to the view file to render the page. Okay. Any questions so far? There's some confused looks. May not be confused looks. Yeah, Sarah.
If you wanted to get more specific with your controllers, so that way your routes are not doing too much logic in them, where would you subdivide that?
So can you give me an example?
No. You have a route and you want to parse a bunch of information before you actually pass it to the view. But that parsing is getting to like, 20 lines long. Parsing. You don't want to do that in the route itself. You want to like export that, or I'm sorry, import it from another folder. What folder would that lie?
So the parsing of the information is coming from, let's say, you're making a call to the database to fetch data, and then you're doing some massaging to that data, and then sending it to the view file.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to give you an example of that.
Okay.
So notice that here I only have a database folder, but I kept saying something called model, right? Like what is a model? So in some frameworks or some like Rails, for example, literally has this folder name called models, which I'm going to create at this point. So you can either create a name called models or even domains is okay. It's like, but let's go with models. So if you create a folder called models, there's going to be a one-to-one mapping of whatever file name that you have in your models folder with your database folder. So if I have a file name called contacts, I'm going to have a file name called contacts in my models folder too. And similarly, I'll have a file name called contacts inside my routes folder. So you're naming the file exactly the same as what you decide that you're operating on, the data that you're operating on. So I'm operating on the contacts data, so I'm going to create a contacts file in my controller. I'm going to create a contacts file in my database. I'm going to create a contacts file in my model. Do you have a question, Hare?
Sure.
Okay. So inside my models now, I'm going to create a file contacts.js. So if we go into the contacts file, so there's some pre-existing code inside of my database folder. And this is just like a bunch of queries that the project already provided. So there's like a function called create contact, function called get contacts, get a specific contact, delete a contact, search for contact, and just exporting these files, these functions, right? So what I want to do now is inside my models, I'm going to require my database file. So // and I'm going to create the exact same functions. So here.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm gonna do some stuff. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna delegate. So I'm just gonna say return db dot create contact.
I think it's for holidays, yeah.
This is contacts, and then same thing here.
Yeah, really, thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah.
So
All right.
this may seem a little redundant or like duplication of code, but can anyone tell me why I'm doing this? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, so,
If you need to switch from PG Promise to Redis, then you only have to change these functions. But everywhere in your code where you're actually calling these functions, you can just leave it calling that same function. And now you change how it actually operates right here in one location.
So what Seraphin's pointing at is like, I'm creating an abstraction here, which is a file which is exposing these functions, create, get, delete, and search. And under the hood, it delegates down to Postgres for now. But tomorrow, if let's say I decide, oh, Postgres doesn't scale for me, I want to use some other database, I only have to change the implementation. The clients of this code can continue calling the same functions and things will just behave as is. Right? Like they don't have to know about the change. So what we're doing is we're creating abstractions which are super useful, and you're so the idea is that you don't want to repeat yourself. So clients shouldn't be dependent on the implementation of your code. They should be only talking to the abstraction. So the abstraction here is this layer of like delegation. Make sense? Questions?
So the abstraction is always, that's what's considered the model. Because like in this file here is sitting inside of the file database.
This is inside database, yeah, DB.
Right? But where is models sitting?
Inside models. Oh, that's like top level too. So it's source models.
So you have, the structure is you have a database folder, you have a models folder, server, and then
And the database just happens to be Postgres. I could create like a database / Postgres, a database / Redis, database /
But in the models, it's always going to hold the abstraction. It's not holding
Yeah, right. And your controllers are always going to be importing the models file and not the database file. Nobody should be importing the database files except the models.
Okay.
Like if you're seeing a require, your database, then you're doing it wrong. As in, you should be calling the abstraction.
Okay.
Right. Except for obviously in the tests where you're literally testing the database. So Seraphin, your original question of like, where would I put a function which is doing a bunch of things here? So if I have a function called massage contacts, I would put it here.
Before it even passes to the controller.
So, or you can even, in your controller, you could call for like get all contacts, right? And then call massage contacts on get all contacts.
Got it.
That's fine too.
So helper functions can kind of like live here in your models.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So going back to the iteration, where am I now? So going back, we now have a database folder with the file contacts. We have a models folder with the file contacts. We have a server folder, which inside server, I usually like to have a folder called routes. And inside routes is the same name as the name that we are operating on, so contacts again. And then index is kind of the amalgamation of all the routes in your system. So let's say I have a file for contacts, I may have a file for users, I may have a file for posts. And then index will be a place where it sort of like takes all of them together and exposes it as like one function. So we can take a look at that here, so real quick. So in server.js, I want to just have one line to import all of my routes. That's the intention, right? So I just want to have like one line each for initialization of all of my different components. So I have one line for routes. I may have one line for authentication. I may have one line for like, setting up some config. So to make that happen, we need something like this, right? We create another router. And we just expose this one router. And then all of our internal routes would be in this file. And then we just expose this. And then when we are mounting this onto our server, it just looks like this. We just app.use, and on the slash, I put in all the routes. And then all the routes would have its own prefix based on the kind of route it is. So in this case, if I'm doing contacts, so I have a prefix for contacts. So if I'm doing users, I'm going to have a prefix for users. And within contacts, server routes, there would be no prefix for this route because the prefix has been taken care of here. Right, so this would just be /new to render the new page. This would just be like posting to / to create a new contact. And this would look very similar to like if I was, if this file was users, it would look pretty much the same too, because I would have router.get /new, and it would render the new user page. Right. Similarly, like if I have a router.post /, it would create a new user. Any questions at this point? Is it making sense? Or is it like, okay. What else? So yeah, so now if you look at the views folder, it seems to be the only folder which isn't super organized. Like there's a bunch of flat files down here. Right? It isn't like, it gets out of hand once you have a lot of domains in your system. So ideally what you want to do is have the same idea where instead of like, since there's multiple files for a single domain, you then have to create a folder with that name. So I would have to create a folder called contacts. And then all of my contact files would go in there. And notice that I have a footer and a header too, right? And these kind of aren't, they don't seem to belong, like they're like unorganized at this point, right? Like, so for example, like the index, the new, and the show are related to contacts. I'm going to move those files there. So move index to contacts, move new to contacts, move show to contacts. Right, so now I have footer, header, and nav, which seem like they're partials. Right, we're using them as partials in all of our different files. So what I would do is I would create mkdir partials and move footer, header, nav, partials. Right, so now it's looking a lot better. And then not found is fine. Like I guess it's the only homeless EJS file. Yeah. So tomorrow, if I have a new file called users, right? All I have to do is create a folder called users, and then all of my user views would go inside the users folder. Yeah, exactly.
Now, when you set EJS as your view engine and you start rendering things, you don't have to provide a path for any of them, but just goes through every single subfolder inside this folder, or do you actually have to go manually?
No, you do have to provide a path. So,
Okay.
so here you're providing the path. So if, let's say this would now become contacts left.
So you do have to manually start adding this
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense? The question was like, because we changed the folder structure here, somewhere somebody has to know that, oh, something has changed, right? And that would happen here. So when you render, you have to provide the relative path. Cool beans. That's all I had for the source files. We can talk a bit about the test files too. Any questions here? I'm going to move on to the test files. Any questions with the source files?
When you divide it up where you have the routes, how would you handle that if some of the routes don't need like authentication, and then you have other routes where it's like once passports happen and it's authenticated, then I wanted to look at these routes over here. Is that something to separate further, or should I still just be doing like app.use/routes and just?
Right. So your app.use, so in your server file, oops. So at some point here, you would have auth.init or something, like some function.
Yeah.
And this would initialize your authentication. And at this point, your route should also be initialized. So those routes would be separate from these routes.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
What do you mean?
So his question is, because like authentication have like a bunch of routes which are authenticated, they're sort of treated separately as these other routes, because they would have a middleware that would check to see whether you're logged in, and if you're not, it'll redirect to like the sign up or sign in page, the way you've created your code. So those files would have to, those routes would be initialized when you call your init function, your authentication function.
But they still exist in the routes folder, right?
Sure.
Okay.
But they wouldn't be like, so if you go into our,
You would just be passing in the parameter that they have to be authenticated, right?
right, so I wonder if you can,
Would you have just pass some middleware function?
yeah, maybe you can just do it out here too. So what you could do is you can say router.use, auth routes, and then you would have your router.use your middleware function for authentication. So ensure logged in, right? And ensure logged in would be your function, which your middleware function that redirects to the auth page if you're not logged in. And then you would still, so that way, your auth init function would just like set up your password with your like settings, and like, password has some authentication, like initialization that needs to happen.
Right.
So that would happen in this function. But then your routes would still live in the routes folder.
Okay.
So the way you have it set up, wouldn't that make it so every route has to be authenticated? Because
Yeah.
of the order you have it in?
Except for the sign in and the login routes. Sign up and the login routes. Because those two the whole point is to like authenticate, right? So you can't have that check for those two routes.
Okay. So how would you separate that? If it's going to be, would it be from the root just /login?
Yeah.
Would it
So
be like /user login? Because then that would have to live inside the user's routes. And then that wouldn't work otherwise.
oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, you can like cheat for those two routes because they're kind of special.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would that be in an index folder in routes, or?
No, you can just have a separate file called authentication in routes/authentication,
Okay.
and then those routes are in there.
Oh, okay. So basically you're saying it just doesn't match the organization, but it still has to come before them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't match the RESTful standard because like in REST, you're operating on a resource. So you're kind of going off topic here, but like when you're using RESTful routing, you're modeling like a resource. So in this case, the resource is a user, and the user should sign in. And actually, in this, to be more pedantic, it would be you are modeling a session, right? So a session, you create a session, you delete a session, you find a session. So your route would be like /session/new, and instead of login, it would be /session/new.
Okay.
Instead of log out, it would be /session/delete. To be really pedantic about
But no one
using
does that.
Yeah, but like because you want nice looking URLs, for these two you kind of like avoid that or ignore that.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so going to the test folder. All right, so let's look at it. Oh, I guess I didn't speak about helpers. So sometimes, even in the source folder, you have sometimes you also have helper functions, which are like functions which don't really belong in like a model folder or in the server folder. So what is a good example of a helper function?
Flatten array.
Yeah, something like it's like a utilities function, right? Like something that is just like can be across all the different files. So something like flatten. Like I have like a nested array and I want to like sort of flatten it out. That could be like a function that lives in the helpers folder.
For the example you showed earlier for parsing information, would that be in the models folder, or would you create a different file or folder for those?
It depends on what the function is doing. If this was doing something very specific to contacts, then it would live here. But if it's doing something generic, then it would live in the helpers folder.
So it's reusable, extracted, basically.
And then also the other thing is, the reason why you create a folder is because you also want to organize your helper functions. Like some helper functions are just like functions which work on arrays, right? And some helper functions are something would work on like objects. So sort of like modeling that too, or organizing those functions as well. Maybe not, may not happen in this at this point, but in the future, like when you go and work out, you would notice that there's helpers or utils, like one of these two names, and then inside those folders you'll have like different files for like similar functions grouped together.
Would you typically name the file after function inside of the helper? Like, do you ever organize the files inside of the helpers?
Yeah.
Folder?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I don't know a good JavaScript project which has this, but I definitely have a project with my previous company which had such a thing. So I'm trying to remember what is their GitHub. Also, GitHub is down, so I don't know. So this is like a utilities. So inside of source, so you have all these different sort of helper functions. So you have like, calculator, calendar, CSV, files, Excel. So they're all related to like the kind of operation that they do, but they're not really like specific to your app as much. They're just generic functions. Yeah. So that would be something that would be inside a helpers folder or a utils folder inside there. So if you decide to go with like a name like models, stick with models everywhere in your so you have a corresponding test/models, right? But if you decide to go with domains, stick with domains in your source as well as domains in your test. Or same with utils or helpers. If you stick with utils, make sure you're sticking with utils in your test too. Cool. So test. So the way, I guess this is a little bit beyond the scope of this talk about like different kinds of tests. But organize your test file names as based on the source files, right? So if I have a contacts.js in my source file, then I would have a contacts.test.js in my test folder, and then based on the kind of test it is. So if it's an integration test, this is something that will be covered in a different talk. But notice that there's always like the same name that I'm using everywhere. So that gives like a sense of grouping to the files. So if I'm like looking at the source code, I can be like, oh, this file is contacts.js. Let me find all the corresponding tests for this file. And all I have to do is find contacts.test.js in my test folder, and they would be the tests for this file. Question, yeah. So,
when you have like config files, like EMB files, you have one EMB for testing environment and one EMB for development, I guess, and then one for production. where would you keep the? Would you keep each one of those .env files in a underneath test and then underneath source, or would you have a single config folder at the root that then contains all the env files?
So you don't have one env file for production and development in that. I mean, you don't have separate files. You just have one env file.
Ah.
Yeah. So in your development, you would just have a .env file, right, which will contain the different configs for your app. In your test, you would have a file which will override those env variables.
Gotcha, manually. Oh, right, because they're already on your.
And then your production, you just like based on where you're deploying, the
That's where you
configs
set
would live in that environment. So in Heroku, for example, you can like add like environment variables as part of your app settings, and that just like overrides the stuff that is already in your app. What else did I have to say? I think that's it. Maybe we can talk. Actually, there is another talk on YouTube on testing, so you should check that out if you're interested in that. But yeah, I think that's all I had for this piece of like code organization. Any questions? How are the new folks doing? Does it make sense? Okay. Cool. Thank you all.
Thank you. Very nice. That's actually exactly